This is not the image Vladimir Putin feared the world would see on a battlefield. It isn't a burning tank column or a drone strike lighting up a Russian oil refinery at 3 in the morning. The image is simpler than that and in many ways more devastating. It is a map of Russia, the largest country on Earth by landmass. And on that map, if you know where to look and what to look for, you can watch Russia getting smaller. Not in territory, not yet, but in something that matters just as much to a man like Vladimir Putin: relevance. This is not a story about Russia losing a war. Losing a war is something empires have done before and survived. This is the story of something more systemic, more irreversible, and more historically significant than battlefield defeat. This is the story of a nuclear superpower sliding into strategic irrelevance because of decisions made by one man. Decisions that cannot be undone, cannot be unwound, and whose consequences are now compounding faster than the Kremlin can manage. As of this week, Russia is fighting on every front simultaneously and losing ground on every single one of them. Not just in Ukraine, though that is where the most visible losses are occurring, but in the Caucasus, in Central Asia, in its own Far East, in its own economy, and in its own people's kitchens, where 81% of Russians are now cutting back on food purchases. Let that number sit with you for a moment. 81%. This is not speculation. This is not Western propaganda. This is documented, data-backed evidence of a nation consuming itself to fund a war its government refuses to end. Stay with me through this full analysis because the scale of what is happening to Russia right now cannot be captured in a headline or a single data point. It has to be laid out systematically, front by front, sector by sector, so that the full picture becomes visible, because the full picture is one that historians are already beginning to put a name to. The self-inflicted collapse of a great power executed in real time by the man who promised to make it great again. To understand why what is happening to Russia right now is so much worse than simply losing a war, you have to start where all of this started, with what Putin actually believed he was doing when he ordered the full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. Putin had a specific vision. It was not complicated and it was not subtle. He wanted to be the leader who reversed Russia's post-Soviet diminishment. He wanted to be spoken of the way the czars were spoken of, the way Soviet leaders were discussed when Russia was at the peak of its global power. He wanted legacy. He wanted reverence. He wanted to look out at a world that responded when Moscow moved, that treated Russia not as a regional power managing its decline, but as the power that shaped the global order. Ukraine was supposed to be the key that unlocked all of that. The so-called special military operation was never simply about territory. It was about prestige. It was about demonstrating to Washington, to Brussels, to NATO, to every government that had watched Russia lose standing since 1991, that the period of Russian weakness was over. Conquer Ukraine. Secure its $15 trillion in mineral wealth. Absorb a massive territory bordering NATO members. Go down in history as the man who restored what the Soviet collapse had taken away. That was the plan. What Putin got instead was a noose he fashioned with his own hands. And right now that noose is tightening around everything he built his identity on. This is not a man who went into the invasion fearing NATO militarily. Let's be precise about that. Putin has never genuinely believed that NATO would initiate direct military conflict with Russia. What consumed him was something more personal and more psychological. He feared that NATO's expansion, the gradual westward drift of former Soviet states, would be the defining feature of his time in power. That history would record the Putin years as the years Russia got smaller, the years the West grew larger, the years that Russia's sphere of influence shrank to something unworthy of the word superpower. For a man whose entire identity is fused with Russia's historical greatness, that prospect was psychologically intolerable. So he invaded. He calculated it would take days, perhaps weeks, certainly not 4 years and counting. And now, as of this morning, Russia still controls less than 20% of Ukrainian territory. The front line is essentially static, measured in hundreds of meters of movement per week at the cost of over 1,000 Russian soldiers killed every day. And everything Putin feared, Russia getting smaller, losing influence, becoming strategically irrelevant, has happened anyway, only faster and because of him. The single most historically ironic consequence of Putin's invasion is what it has done to the country he invaded. Because Ukraine, the country that was supposed to be erased from the map, absorbed into a reconstituted Russian sphere, reduced to a vassal state in Putin's new imperial order, has instead become one of the more consequential military and diplomatic success stories of the early 21st century. The Atlantic Council has reported that Ukrainian soldiers now routinely outperform NATO colleagues in joint training exercises. Read that carefully. The country Putin invaded specifically to prevent from joining NATO has become, through the brutal crucible of 4 years of war against one of the world's largest armies, so militarily capable and so operationally experienced that it is functioning inside the NATO security architecture without formal membership. The invasion that was supposed to close off Ukraine's Western orientation has instead accelerated, validated, and deepened it in ways that no diplomatic negotiation could ever have achieved. Beyond the military dimension, Ukraine has been building an entirely new economic and diplomatic profile. Decade-long agreements with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates covering financing, energy cooperation, and technology transfer have been constructed on the foundation of the drone technology and defense industry that Ukraine was forced to develop to survive the invasion. Ukraine entered this war as a country whose military and industrial base was dependent on Soviet-era inheritance. It is emerging from it as a defense technology exporter with relationships across the Gulf, the Transatlantic Alliance, and the Indo-Pacific. The country that was supposed to be Putin's trophy is now his cautionary tale. The country that was supposed to validate his legacy is instead dismantling it, and that is only the beginning of the story. It is happening simultaneously across every dimension of Russian power, and the fronts are compounding each other. Russia has exercised dominant influence over the South Caucasus for a century and a half. Under Putin, that influence was maintained through a deliberate strategy of managed tension, playing Armenia against Azerbaijan, providing just enough military and political backing to whichever nation was most useful at any given moment, and using energy dependency as a lever of coercive control. It was a sophisticated system calibrated over decades, and it has collapsed. The rupture with Azerbaijan began with a specific documented event. Russian police in Yekaterinburg tortured 2 Azerbaijani citizens to death during a crackdown. The incident triggered arrests, formal espionage accusations, and a diplomatic deterioration that went from tense to irreparable within months. Then in December 2024, Russia shot down an Azerbaijani civilian passenger aircraft, killing 38 people on board. The Kremlin's initial response was evasion and deflection. Azerbaijan's response was to turn its back on Moscow entirely. A relationship that Russia had cultivated and managed for generations was severed in the span of 2 incidents that the Kremlin's behavior made unforgivable. Armenia's drift away from Russia has been even more methodical and in some ways more humiliating for Moscow. Putin personally issued an economic ultimatum to Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan. End Armenia's push toward the European Union, or face the consequences of losing the preferential gas prices Russia had been providing 177.5050 cents per 1,000 cubic meters versus the per 1,000 cubic meters versus the European market rate of $600. It was the kind of blunt coercive leverage that Russia had deployed successfully against smaller neighbors for years. Pashinyan called the bluff. He pressed forward with the EU alignment. He stood for re-election and won. The pro-Russian candidates lost. By June 8th, the outcome was official and unmistakable. Russian pressure had been applied. Russian pressure had failed. Armenia is leaving Russia's orbit. 2 nations, 1 region, 150 years of Russian dominance gone. Not taken by a rival military power, not lost in a war, walked away from voluntarily by governments that looked at Russia's performance in Ukraine and concluded that the protection being offered was no longer worth the dependency it required. This is what analysts mean when they say Russia is getting smaller. The shrinkage is not always measured in square kilometers. Sometimes it is measured in relationships, in influence, in the credibility of a guarantee that nobody believes anymore. The Caucasus is not an isolated case. Across the entire periphery of Russia's former sphere of influence, The same pattern is playing out with different actors and different timelines, but the same directional logic. Moldova is pursuing European Union membership with a seriousness and pace that would have been difficult to imagine before 2022. Georgia is in political turbulence. Its pro-Russian government facing sustained domestic opposition from a population whose orientation is increasingly and unambiguously westward. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, which spent the post-Soviet decades in various states of nervous accommodation with Russian pressure, are now among the most assertive voices in NATO for sustained and unconditional support of Ukraine. Having concluded that the threat they spent 30 years managing has been definitively exposed as real. In Central Asia, the picture is more complex, but equally damaging for Moscow. Kazakhstan and Tajikistan are both members of the Eurasian Economic Union, the Russia-designed and Russia economic architecture that has served as the primary mechanism for circumventing Western sanctions and maintaining Russian commercial dominance across the post-Soviet space. Russia built that union to project power and to bind former Soviet republics into continued dependency. But to sustain the war in Ukraine, Russia has been pulling weapons, equipment, and military assets out of the security arrangements it had committed to with these Central Asian partners. The promises of protection that anchored those relationships have been quietly broken, redirected into the Ukrainian meat grinder. Kazakhstan and Tajikistan have noticed governments that once carefully balanced between Moscow and other partners are reconsidering the terms of that balance if either country moves to reduce its participation in the Eurasian Economic Union, insulted by broken security promises and watching Russia's economic trajectory with increasing alarm. Russia loses the very financial architecture that has kept it partially functional under the weight of Western sanctions. The union that was supposed to extend Russian power is now one more structure at risk of being undermined by the war that was supposed to demonstrate that power. Beyond the immediate post-Soviet periphery, the consequences of Russia's performance in Ukraine are being felt across every relationship in which Moscow had positioned itself as a security guarantor. And the signal being sent by Russia's inability to protect its clients is one that every government in the world is incorporating into its strategic calculations: Syria, Venezuela, Iran. Three countries whose governments had placed significant weight on Russian backing as a component of their own survival strategies. Three countries whose leaders have either been deposed, killed, or severely weakened since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began. Russia raised no effective hand to save any of them, whether that reflects a deliberate Kremlin decision or a military capacity so degraded by the Ukrainian war that effective intervention elsewhere was simply no longer possible, is for analytical purposes almost beside the point. The observable outcome is identical either way. Russian protection failed to protect. The message has been received with cold clarity in every capital that was weighing the value of Russian alignment. Estonia's International Center for Defense and Security assessed it directly. Neighboring nations have received very clear evidence of how dangerous it is to depend on a legacy-obsessed leader willing to destroy everything in pursuit of his own mythology. Former Russian client states are not balancing anymore. They are choosing, and the direction of those choices is not toward Moscow. Russia's global prestige, the soft power, the credibility, the assumption of military competence that undergirded decades of Russian diplomatic and strategic influence is at its lowest point since Vladimir Putin first came to power. The paper tiger has been exposed, and the world, watching 4 years of grinding Russian military failure against a country a fraction of its size, is adjusting its assessments accordingly. Now we come to the dimension of Russia's strategic collapse that receives the least Western media attention relative to its long-term historical significance. What is happening in Russia's Far East right now is not a military event. It produces no satellite imagery of burning infrastructure, no dramatic battlefield footage. But in terms of the permanent structural consequences for Russian sovereignty and Russian power, it may ultimately prove to be the most consequential development of this entire period. Russia's Far Eastern Federal District represents 40% of Russian territory. It is home to only 8 million people, a population density so low that it has always represented a strategic vulnerability. China has maintained historical territorial claims over parts of this region for generations. And China, with the patience and strategic sophistication that has characterized its foreign policy across decades, has found a way to act on those interests without the diplomatic costs of military action. When European companies fled Russia following the February 2022 invasion and the subsequent sanctions regime, the commercial vacuum they left behind was filled rapidly, comprehensively, and deliberately by Chinese firms. In doing so, Beijing created an economic dependency that has given China leverage over the Russian economy that no amount of Russian diplomatic maneuvering can offset. Chinese workers have followed Chinese commercial interests into Russia's Far East in significant numbers. Special administrative regions and advanced special economic zones across Siberia now operate under frameworks that give Chinese commercial entities extraordinary latitude. And in those zones for the economic activities that Chinese companies conduct, the yuan has functionally replaced the ruble as the operating currency in Russian territory. The Chinese currency has replaced the Russian one in Russian territory. Putin cannot stop this. He knows with full clarity that Russia does not survive economically without Chinese participation. China currently purchases approximately 50% of Russia's crude oil exports. That single dependency, the degree to which Russia's ability to fund its own war, depends on Chinese willingness to keep buying Russian oil, gives Beijing a degree of leverage over the Kremlin that no Western sanctions package has achieved. If that relationship's sour, if China decided to reduce its oil purchases or tighten its terms, everything Putin is fighting for collapses within months. So Putin watches. He accepts it. He has no meaningful alternative. The man who launched a war to make Russia bigger is watching China quietly absorb Russian territory through commercial and demographic means, and he cannot say a single public word about it because saying anything risks the relationship that is keeping his war machine funded. This is what strategic desperation looks like at the highest levels of power. Let's turn to what is happening inside Russia itself, because the external collapse of Russian influence is being matched step by step by an internal economic deterioration that Russian state media cannot fully suppress, and that the data, even adjusted for Kremlin manipulation, reveals with damning clarity. The official Russian inflation figure, as reported by state statistical agencies, sits at approximately 5.3% year over year. Swedish intelligence analysts who have been tracking the divergence between official Russian economic data and independently verifiable indicators assess the real inflation rate at closer to 15%. That figure is nearly at parity with Russia's official central bank interest rate of 14.25%, 25%, meaning that for ordinary Russian borrowers, the real cost of money is being consumed entirely by the real erosion of purchasing power. Loans that might have helped families or small businesses survive the economic stress of the war economy are in real terms unaffordable. The result is visible in the grocery data. 81% of Russians are cutting back on food purchases. The breakdown is specific. 34% are economizing, buying cheaper alternatives, reducing variety, cutting back on non-essentials. 47% are actively reducing the quantity of food they purchase. This is not a population managing temporary belt-tightening in service of a national effort they believe in. This is a population being consumed by a war their government refuses to end, making survival decisions about basic nutrition. In the first 3 months of 2026 alone, 200,000 small and medium-sized Russian businesses went bankrupt. Not struggling, gone, closed permanently in a single quarter. The small business sector that forms the connective tissue of any functioning economy is being wiped out at a rate that will take years, possibly decades, to reverse. And the government's response is not relief or restructuring. It is more extraction. Moscow is planning to cut over 105,000 workers from the public sector in 2026, following 32,000 cuts in 2025. Russia's federal road maintenance budget is being slashed by more than $142 million this year, with an additional $260 million reduction planned for the following year, representing thousands of kilometers of highway construction and maintenance simply eliminated from the national plan because there is no money. Pension reform is being gutted, Co-financing mechanisms for retirement accounts are being eliminated and replaced with tax incentives directed at the private sector, a private sector that is going bankrupt at 200,000 businesses per quarter. This is the structure of a state being hollowed out in real time. Every ruble that can be found, every budget line that can be cut, every public service that can be reduced is being redirected into a war that has already consumed far more than Russia bargained for and shows no sign of ending on Putin's terms. Russia is not funding a war machine that is winning. Russia is funding a war machine that is preventing the state from being able to function normally. And the ordinary Russian population is absorbing the cost of that dysfunction in their daily lives, in their grocery bills, in their retirement accounts, in the roads beneath their vehicles. What does the man responsible for all of this actually know about the situation he has created? This is a question that matters enormously for assessing where this goes next. And the answer is more disturbing than simple ignorance would be. Reporting from multiple independent sources with access to the Russian political environment describes Putin as increasingly isolated. Not isolated in the physical sense, he continues to appear publicly, to conduct meetings, to issue statements, isolated in the formational sense. The advisors around him have learned through years of watching what happens to those who deliver unwelcome assessments that their continued proximity to power depends on telling Putin what his framework accommodates rather than what the facts require. The feedback loops that might have corrected his strategic course, that might have produced an honest assessment of the Ukrainian military's resilience, the economic cost of the war, the erosion of Russia's international standing, have been severed by Putin's own decades-long campaign to surround himself with loyalists rather than analysts. The result is a leader making decisions based on information that has been filtered through multiple layers of institutional self-preservation. He is not receiving the full picture, and the picture he is not receiving is the one that would tell him his last major gamble is failing. That gamble is the Donbass. Capturing the Donbass, Ukraine's industrial eastern heartland, has become Putin's remaining scenario for claiming something that looks like victory. If Russia can take the Donbass by the end of 2026, Putin can negotiate from a position that to a domestic audience resembles strength. He can point to a territorial gain. He can construct a narrative around the achievement. He can argue to the audiences that matter most to his political survival that the sacrifice was not meaningless. The problem is what Russian forces are actually encountering in the Donbass. Analysts studying the conflict closely have described what Ukrainian defenders have constructed in the east as a fortress belt, layered, interlocking, mutually supporting defensive positions built over months, specifically to channel Russian offensive pressure into kill zones that extract maximum cost for minimum territorial gain. Russia is not breaking through this architecture. It is crashing against it repeatedly at a cost measured in men and equipment that Russia's personnel and industrial base can absorb in the short term, but cannot sustain indefinitely. The Donbass is not falling by the end of 2026. The evidence for that assessment is visible in the daily engagement counts, in the territorial measurement data, in the casualty figures that Russia is generating in exchange for the hundreds of meters of movement that constitute a good week on the Eastern Front. When that gamble fails, when the timeline expires without the prize, the reckoning inside the Kremlin will be unlike anything the Putin system has previously had to manage. There is a dimension of Russia's self-inflicted damage that operates on a longer timeline than the economic crisis or the battlefield situation, but whose consequences will ultimately prove more permanent than either. Russia is consuming its own demographic future. The scale of Russian military personnel losses since February 2022 is staggering. Over 1.3 million soldiers killed or seriously wounded, according to Ukrainian military assessments that have been broadly consistent with independent analytical tracking throughout the war. These are not statistics. They are working age men, the labor force, the fathers, the skilled tradespeople, the engineers, the teachers who chose not to immigrate, removed from Russian society permanently at a pace of 30,000 to 35,000 casualties per month. Russia is bleeding its own population in ways that demographic recovery models suggest will require a generation to even partially address. Compounding the casualty losses is the immigration wave. Following the September 2022 mobilization announcement, an estimated 500,000 to 800,000 Russians, disproportionately educated, skilled, young, and internationally mobile, left Russia. These were not the people most committed to Putin's project. They were the people who had the most to lose from it and the means to leave. Their departure has hollowed out sectors of the Russian economy that depend on precisely those skills: technology, finance, professional services, medicine, education. Russia's labor market now shows official unemployment at approximately 2%, a figure that, rather than representing economic health, reflects the mass mobilization of working-age men into the military combined with the immigration of hundreds of thousands of others. There are not enough people to fill the roles the economy requires. The businesses that haven't gone bankrupt are operating with chronic labor shortages. The government that is cutting public sector workers cannot find qualified replacements for those it is retaining. Russia is simultaneously running out of soldiers and running out of workers because in a country that has been sending its young men to die in Ukraine for 4 years, those two categories increasingly overlap. No analysis of Russia's strategic collapse would be complete without addressing Crimea, because Crimea is the place where the entire architecture of Putin's legacy is most visibly and most publicly coming apart. Putin annexed Crimea in 2014 and spent a decade turning it into the symbol of everything his project stood for. The Kerch Bridge, the multi-billion-dollar engineering monument he personally inaugurated, driving a construction truck across it for the cameras, was his proof that Russia could do what others said was impossible. Crimea was the crown jewel, the proof point, the answer to every skeptic who questioned whether Putin's Russia could deliver. Ukraine is dismantling it systematically, methodically, and without sending a single soldier onto the peninsula. The campaign has been running for months, targeting the logistical choke points that connect Crimea to the Russian mainland, railway crossings, fuel convoys, bridge infrastructure on both sides of the Kerch crossing. The June 25th strike package hit 38 separate targets in a single day, including a thermal power station and electrical substations in both Simfal and Sevastopol. Power is failing. Water pressure is dropping. Fuel is rationed at 20 liters per transaction. Food shelves are thinning. Satellite imagery from late June 2026 showed a 15-kilometer traffic jam on the Kerch Bridge. Civilian vehicles, families, occupiers who moved to Crimea on the strength of Putin's promise that it was Russian forever now queued for hours to cross back to the mainland. The queue heading into Crimea was 1/3 the size of the queue heading out. Nobody is rushing toward what Putin built. Everyone who can leave is leaving.